It's Season 5 of The Simpsons, aka the most difficult set of episodes to rank. I took all 22 of them, cut them down to 15 semifinalists, and then I basically paced around nervously for several days until I could settle on 10 finalists. Also, I accepted a lot of bribes. So here are my top 10 Simpsons episodes from Season 5. Homer Loves Flanders is awesome for the same reason why the film What About Bob is awesome. Sometimes it's fun to just watch a story about one character torturing another one. In The Simpsons case, it's about seeing the dichotomy between these two be flipped on its head. Ned has always rolled with the punches when it comes to his disagreeable neighbor. I like seeing this alternate dimension that suggests maybe Flanders would be better off keeping his distance. Maybe Homer would make his life miserable. It features a ton of memorable, and dare I say, memeable, moments. Always love this runner about Moe reading books to people in his spare time. I also enjoy this obscure moment when Todd Flanders doesn't get how this sheep story could apply to him. Oh, Todd. This episode is full of unexpected little character moments like that. And hey, there's Just Stamp the Ticket Man. That's always a point in an episode's favor. Now, I don't think the meta stuff with Lisa and Bart really works. The self-awareness isn't necessary and doesn't add a lot. The flash forward is just strange. I also think they go a bit too far with Homer's destructiveness. Destroying Flanders' car is too over the top for me. Other than those nitpicks, Homer Loves Flanders is a strong addition to the sacred tome of Ned Flanders episodes. You don't have to be hepped up on goofballs to enjoy this one. Deep Space Homer is making this list because of its spectacle. I know, this was a big stunt designed by the show to get our attention. But I've got to applaud the hustle. Homer floating around in space with those potato chips is pretty darn cool. The fact that there are still over 25 seasons of material after this point is pretty darn hilarious. I wouldn't say the Homer character stuff is particularly strong here. His arc begins promising enough with that inanimate carbon rod, but after this point, Homer's motivation mostly gets brushed aside. Most of the emphasis goes toward the satirical elements. To their credit, these work very well. The commentary still feels fresh today. Our boredom with NASA, their declining ratings, and their ridiculous scheme to be relevant. It's like the plot of Armageddon, except, less stupid. The episode was smart to bring Barney along for Act 2. He is a nice change of pace character for an otherwise Homer-centric story. I think they were also wise to limit the actual space stuff to Act 3. Just hit us with those potato chips, that wonderful Kent Brockman joke about our insect overlords, and a beautifully awkward James Taylor song. They bookend their story with more of that inanimate carbon rod, which feels like the only way it could end. That rod never does get a prominent role in later Simpsons episodes, so we should honor this American hero with the number 9 spot on a random YouTube countdown. That seems fair. I gotta be honest here. Burns' Heir is the most uneven episode on this list. Half of this thing is basically a tug of war over Bart, and the ways they pull him back and forth get increasingly contrived. There's not a lot of substance to the plot. They have to invent complications just to keep this thing going. However, sometimes the sheer charisma of the characters is enough to smooth over any weak points. This is a wonderful Mr. Burns showcase, highlighting how he's basically a wizard who can do anything at any moment. Just throw everything at Bart. Just try everything within his power to convince him to stick with stodgy and old-fashioned Mr. Burns. These two definitely have common ground, and watching that push and pull between them is one of the biggest draws of the episode. Furthermore, this is probably the weakest and most useless the Simpson family had ever been in combating their problem. Although that's not so bad if it leads to jokes like this. Also, what's up with that joke about Homer eating flowers? It's so hilariously weird. I think that's a good way to sum up Burns' Heir as a whole. It's a hilariously weird adventure. It goes for certain jokes that others wouldn't attempt. Yeah, there are definitely more consistent episodes, and much better Burns-centric ones, but the bizarre elements in this one makes it stand out among the crowd. Frankly, the only thing it's missing is a robotic Richard Simmons. Alright, so bear with me on this one. But what I like best about Boy Scouts in the Hood is its sugar. Do 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 do. Okay, that's enough of that. But much like the syrup-fueled drug trip, this is an episode that hits us with those sugar highs and sugar crashes over and over and over again. It always starts us off in this super low energy place, whether it's bumming around, getting dragged to boring meetings, or being stuck on a raft in the middle of nowhere. And then these situations inevitably explode into nonsense. Because these story elements always come crashing down to earth, it always feels like there's rising action to the plot, that it's always taking us somewhere new. They plant the Homer and Bart stuff throughout Act 2 that by the time it morphs into a father and son storyline, I'm totally on board. Is the story a little unfocused? Yeah, probably. There are definitely much deeper father-son episodes in the series. I like to think of this as being more of a hybrid episode, where you get elements of that stuff, but also throw in the dynamics from Homer Flanders episodes and their more parody-driven affairs. Sometimes the sheer variety is enough to win the day, and I think Boy Scouts in the Hood gets there. Who would have thought that a missing peanut could lead to all of this? You know, after watching Marge vs. the Monorail last season, and now Springfield in this one, we really gotta give some credit to Marge for what she brings to these larger-than-life stories. I don't want to give the short shrift to the secondary characters and its guest stars, like obviously Mr. Burns brings the funny, and Robert Goulet gets one of my favorite jokes of the season. All of that is great. Don't need to talk about any of that stuff. Marge does such a great job grounding these kind of stories, giving us that fish out of water element and enhancing the commentary about the topic. We all would expect this kind of problem to happen to Homer, but it's harder to make a point about gambling addiction with the most addictive personality in the family. It's like, if this could happen to Marge, this could happen to anyone. They don't even have to spend a lot of time justifying it, just a quick win and a glance at her watch, and we understand why she gets sucked in. It's really well paced. Somehow they include a Homer gets a job storyline and separate subplots starring Bart and Mr. Burns, and yet the stuff back at the Simpson house still doesn't feel that rushed. They integrate just enough of Lisa throughout the story to make these emotional stakes actually matter. I think some of these macro episodes can shortchange its characters, or limit them to shallow and meaningless arcs. I think Springfield gets this balance right. It's both an extremely fun episode, and one that brings a new dynamic to Marge that'll periodically show up in years to come. For the 100th episode in the series, I love that they went back to school and did a Bart Skinner story. The series literally started out at Springfield Elementary. Season 1 had a lot of that Bart Mania pranks and stuff. This is a good example of how far the show had come since then. We get that mundane look at childhood, that familiar situation of Bart inadvertently creating chaos at school, but instead of telling this totally Bart-centric story about guilt, it examines his relationship with Skinner in full detail. I think a lot of its appeal is just in how eccentric all the characters are. That Skinner, in his spare time, is this guy conducting orchestra recordings for fun. That his mom sort of hovers around and alerts him of the time. That Ned Flanders had these beatnik parents that got on his case. This episode is just full of down-to-earth observational humor, less reliant on random mishaps, and instead more driven by its characters. They even managed to sneak in some social commentary about the state of our public schools. I wish this ending was less abrupt, and there was a slightly more interesting plan than bringing in Chalmers, but it's worth it for this line alone. I gotta be honest though, the real reason this episode climbed this high in the rankings is because it's got Billy and the Clonosaurus, which is one of my favorite jokes in the entire series. Apu's rant is legendary. This is a Treehouse of Horror episode with Lionel Hutz in it. How is it not going to finish in the top 5 for the season? This episode's got some iconic villains in it. Ned Flanders as the devil, Mr. Burns as Dracula, absolutely spot on, both of them. Yeah, maybe the gremlin itself isn't that iconic, but in general, the Twilight Zone parody is, dang it. Don't tell Uter that he isn't iconic. As story concepts, this special features a nice mix of elements. We get the juxtaposition of the surreal and down-to-earth, then some psychological thriller elements, then a sort of horror adventure plot. Although it's gotta be the most sedentary Treehouse of Horror ever. This is definitely the year of sitting around and worrying about stuff. Special shout out to the animation of Treehouse of Horror 4, which is easily the prettiest episode of Season 5. The character designs, the acting and facial expressions, the backgrounds, there is so much eye candy in here. If you're going to do a tense and atmospheric segment like the Gremlin one, you have to get the acting right. This segment lives and dies by its visual direction. They passed this test with flying colors. Treehouse of Horror 4's combination of killer jokes and beautiful animation makes it not only one of The Simpsons' best Halloween specials ever, but also one of the best of Season 5. It's funny, The Last Temptation of Homer doesn't feel like a Season 5 episode. It's easily the biggest oddball of this list, at least tonally. It's super surreal and is chock full of fantasies and references, like a Season 4 example, but it's extremely high concept and meta, like something out of Seasons 7 and 8. I love how magical the concept is, that the entire world basically conspires to tempt Homer into cheating on Marge. There are so many ways he can break from this storyline, but the world forces him to Mindy. Of course Marge would come down with a cold, of course she would. The downside of all this is that Mindy is less of an organic character and more of a narrative device, specifically characterized to serve the plot. To the writer's credit, it's not like Mindy is just an objectified blank slate. They make it clear that she's struggling with this odd situation as well. The plot needs her to make Homer cheat on Marge, but she doesn't pressure Homer into doing something he doesn't want to do. She's designed to be a rom-com plot device, but acts like a real person. Imagine that. I realize I'm glossing over the numerous classic jokes contained in this episode. They certainly are numerous. But I think the character writing is the standout here. You can tell that The Last Temptation of Homer cares deeply about his character motivations, and wants to make every relationship count. I admire that this episode brings out the best in everyone. Also, Bart has a subplot about becoming a nerd or something. Rosebud is like the perfect intersection of all the best things about a Mr. Burns plot. We get the Citizen Kane angle from Three Cars in Every Garage, we get the contentious negotiations from Last Exit to Springfield, we even get the huge scale of manipulations from Who Shot Mr. Burns. Heck, you could argue this was the big foreshadowing moment for Who Shot Mr. Burns. That isn't to say that Rosebud doesn't bring anything new to the table. We had never gotten a real look into Mr. Burns' past, never looked at how this monster came into existence. I wouldn't say this is a super deep character study or anything, but I think this human element balances out the ridiculous nonsense of the plot. It is infinitely funnier to have the super important MacGuffin be this mangled and disgusting teddy bear. They get so much mileage out of Homer being totally oblivious to the bear, as well as Mr. Burns' many attempts to get it back. Season 5 is really fond of its elderly characters breaking into homes, huh? The plot goes to so many different directions, we end up getting a ridiculously diverse set of jokes, from the birthday party, to the negotiations, to the TV sitcom jokes. Although, there is so much amazing Burns-Smithers material here, it makes me wonder, would I watch an entire sitcom about Mr. Burns and Smithers? Yes. Make it happen, Disney. Okay, be honest. How many of you love Cape Fear, the Simpsons episode, but have never seen either of the films it's based on? Me? I've only seen the 1991 remake, and even that was way after being able to quote this entire episode. I think a lot of us saw the Simpsons version first, and were like, wow, this episode has a lot of tension and suspense. Look at all these beautifully animated sequences. I feel like I'm missing something here. It's such a brilliant choice for adaptation. They barely have to spend any time tweaking the concept or justifying character motivations. It's all right there. Instead, they focus on filling the story with as many side-splitting jokes as possible. We've got the rake joke, D Bart D, hello Mr. Thompson, the HMS Pinafore, all the screw the audience jokes, the rake joke. I could go on and on. These gags are so much fun that I forget the story centers around Sideshow Bob stalking a 10-year-old boy. I could imagine a much darker and more sinister version of this episode. I'm glad the writers were wise enough, and mentally tired enough, to let this concept go cuckoo bananas. Just focus on making this a Roadrunner cartoon. Don't worry, the darkness of the concept will shine through. Those music stings will carry the day. Kelsey Grammer's singing will carry the day. Sometimes I want to laugh at the edge of my seat, and Cape Fear achieves that better than any other episode of The Simpsons. Now I know what you're thinking with this ranking. Cape Fear at number 1 is super duper predictable. But subverting expectations is David Merkin's thing, not mine. At least for now it is. The other episodes after number 10 were honestly very difficult to rank. I'm tentatively going with Homer Goes to College at number 15, then Homer's Barbershop Quartet, then Marge on the Lam, then Lisa vs. Malibu Stacy, and finally Bart Gets Famous as the Bubble episode. I say these are tentatively ranked because it turns out Season 5 is full of solid episodes that are very similar in quality. I could have probably put 18 of the 22 episodes on this teaser graphic. It's ridiculous. Let me know in the comments how you would rank the Season 5 episodes. Which ones do you think are overrated? Which don't get enough love? I'm not the biggest Homer Goes to College person, for example, but I could certainly be talked into thinking it is the most brilliant thing ever. Let your voice be heard. Now we are onward to Season 6, in which we go back to the past for Maggie, start a national emergency with Australia in the present, and jump forward to the futuristic year of 2010. My god, this series is old. But it should be a good time anyway. Season 6 is an amazing season. As always, thanks for watching.